I am Jack Brewer with Expanding Frontiers Research. I'm joined today by Vanessa Walilko of Personal Pans Podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Vanessa and I are going to talk some about domestic violence and more specifically, how we, as the people around victims of domestic violence, might best support them. As I understand it, Vanessa, you have a degree in sociology and have contributed to formal research published on the topic. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, I got my bachelor's in sociology at DePaul University, and the last 2 years of my undergrad, I was working with a professor who was doing an assessment of the Cook County Domestic Violence Program. So she had interviewed nearly 200 men who had gone through this program to see its effectiveness, but also to talk with them about how they viewed their own violence. And again, just to see if that had any impact, if the program had any impact on making change on their behavior.
Thank you. When we think of victims of domestic violence, it's obviously important for them to remove themselves from the abuse. Now, months and years after that, the ordeal can continue through intimidation, stalking, all kinds of mentally abusive behavior, as well as ongoing police interaction, court appearances. So, could you please walk us through a little the state of mind of a victim of domestic abuse? What are they thinking about and how are they emotionally feeling?
Sure. So first, I just wanted to thank you for actually having this conversation, because so much of the literature is about preventing men from perpetuating violence, but doesn't really talk to the victim's experience. It's really centered on the abusers. Even with this assessment of the program, we tried to reach out to the survivors of abuse, and it was so hard to get them to talk, to even communicate with them because of what you're talking about. Even when someone has left an abusive relationship, the trauma, the complex PTSD remains. So first, I think I want to talk about the cycle of violence and how this gets started in the first place. So typically, an abusive person doesn't start out as abusive. There's actually a book called The Borderline Personality by Donald Dutton, and he tried to make the argument that abusive, in his context, abusive men were very much like people with borderline personality disorder. So there's this initial honeymoon phase, and typically women talk about getting like love bombed in this initial phase where they're perfect and they fill all the needs of this abusive person. And there's a lot of projecting happening. But the person who is receiving all of this attention, love bombing is a more popular term now. They don't know what's about to come next, right? They just see somebody who's engaged and interested and wants to have them as a part of their life. And then a person is just a person and not an object anymore. And that's typically when abuse starts. It also typically starts as verbal abuse, because the person is essentially like ramping up and seeing what their partner will take, and have already put this partner in a position where they're wondering what happened, right? They started out this incredibly loving partner, and then all of a sudden they're being demeaned, they're being criticized, and then typically it escalates to being physically abused. And the entire time, the abuser is isolating them from their families, from their friends, from their communities, telling them that nobody is going to love them like they do, that nobody cares about them like they do, that nobody is ever going to love them. And so you start this cycle of, again, demeaning, gaslighting a person to the point where they don't see a way out. And they might not even think they're worthy of a way out because they have been systematically, their self-esteem has been systematically destroyed by the abusive person. There's also this idea of the cycle of violence. So there'll be this honeymoon phase, and then a trigger event, and then violence, and then this reconciliation. And so, that initial love bombing, that'll happen again. I'm so sorry, I'll never do that again. I don't know what got into me. I fill in the blank, any number of excuses. And I saw this in the research because we not only did surveys with all these men, but had in-depth interviews with them. And there's a lot of, well, she pushes my buttons. Well, she pushed me to do this. There's no locating the violence within their own behavior. It's something external triggered them and made them do this. So it's a way of minimizing their own involvement in that violence. So it's just incredibly difficult. Again, also I wanted to bring up, when people are experiencing intimate partner violence and it's escalating and it's escalating and it's escalating, the question that always came up, at least when I first started doing this research, was, well, why don't they leave? And the reality is that when women actually leave an abusive relationship, that's when they're most likely to be murdered. There was a New York study that came out when I was an undergrad that said 60% of women who were murdered by current or former partners. I think the number has changed over the years, but it's at least 40%, depending on the area. So there is this incredibly intense pressure where, again, even if you find the courage and want to leave, that fear that he will try to take control back, and the ultimate way of taking control over someone's life is killing them. And so when someone leaves, again, there's this constant threat that maybe they'll come back, maybe they'll hurt me again. Again, abusers don't want to let go. And in some cases continue to intimidate. Like I said, that's why it was so hard for us to talk to actual survivors. There were very few women who were willing to put their names and phone numbers on record or with people that they didn't trust completely. And so you don't get as many of these stories immediately. You'll usually get stories a decade later, sometimes 20 years later from abuse, because they're finally removed enough. Either they've moved across the country, in some cases, moved to other countries just to escape and to feel safe. And even then, again, complex PTSD is a serious medical issue. It lives in the body. There is intense nervous system dysregulation that doesn't just go away because somebody is outside of that environment. It takes a lot of work to not react and not expect that kind of violence all the time after a situation like that.
Sure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So those of us in the orbit of the victim, how do they typically receive these allegations? What kinds of things are they thinking about? And I could envision that family members might feel some helplessness, anger, frustration, just a wide range of things. So how are situations like that happening?
So, as you mentioned, a lot of different things happen. And because there is this, again, that love bombing, that manipulation, that gaslighting, no one's ever going to love you like I love you. If you have friends or family around you that maybe tipped off, maybe see some red flags that you don't because you're in that situation, and they start pointing it out, if that gets back to the abuser, suddenly the abuser's on a campaign to get that person out of your life. Because any lack of control, how do we destroy that? How do we remove that? So you'll see abusive partners moving their victims to other areas in order sometimes to physically get them away from their friends and family. And it can be incredibly frustrating if you love somebody and you're seeing them in a relationship and you're seeing bruises or you're seeing personality changes, you're seeing somebody go through a depression. If you care about somebody, you don't want them to be in that situation. But again, a person in that situation doesn't necessarily see A, how bad it is, and B, that there's a way out. Again, because of that systematic psychological demoralization that's happening. So sometimes you see friends and family even remove the abused person out of their life because they don't want to see it anymore, and they kind of treat it almost like an addiction model, where like, okay, I'll give you consequences and you'll change. Again, it's a totally different scenario, because what a person needs when they're going through that is support, and they need somebody who is going to listen, and then when they are ready, somebody is going to help them act to get out of that situation. Because when you are abused, again, it's typically never just physical abuse. There's so much psychological abuse that precedes that and goes along with it. And so you don't think you have any power. You don't think you have agency. You think that so much of your life is wrapped up in this person. And again, it can be hard to see a way out. And because you're still hoping for that initial honeymoon period, that initial sweet time, you're like, well, I thought I knew this person. It's like, well, you knew one side of them, but there's this whole other side. And again, because they're like gaslit constantly, it can be really difficult. I mean, I saw this more with sexual abuse survivors than domestic violence, but there's oftentimes this like this doubt, like, I don't believe what you're saying, especially if the person who is abusive is charismatic. This is something too that I want to make clear. Abusers know when to turn on the charm. And again, it's all reputation management, reputation control. They can hit their partner in private and they can be incredibly charming to you in person. And so if you catch wind that they were violent, you're going to minimize it, because your experience with this person is that they're gracious and that they're kind and they're charming and they're welcoming. Again, it undermines even what abusers talk about their own abuse when they're like, well, I just got triggered, it was something out of my control. It's like, except you know who to be nice around, so clearly it's not out of control, it's a choice. So again, I do understand the frustration, because I have also been friends with people in abusive relationships. And again, you have to listen, believe them when they tell you something is going on, and then also give them the emotional support that they need so they have the courage to leave when they're ready. But this is another important thing. We talk about leaving these relationships, right? Get out of these situations. It's a terrible situation. But if there are no social structures in place to protect people who are leaving abusive relationships, what's going to happen to them, right? If there isn't like a strong judicial rules, like if there aren't strong no contact orders,
which there are not.
There are not. No, this is the infuriating thing. And again, I know I'm jumping around, but because I worked in the women's and gender studies department, we talked a lot about, like I said, sexual abuse. And they always talk about like sexual assault, and like the second assault is going through the judicial system, because you people will doubt your credibility, undermine you all the time. Again, perfect example. There were so many instances in this literature where a woman will be abused and call the police, and the police arrive, and the guy is super calm. He's calm, cool, and collected. And the partner who has been hit is in hysterics because she's just been beaten, tossed around. And so the guy's just able to talk to the cops like, oh, she got a little out of control. It's okay. And nothing happens. Nothing happens. So again, you have to look into like issues of social misogyny and all these other social structures that again deny and minimize the pain that women go through, and make it again harder for them to escape in the first place.
Yes, I feel like I have observed social misogyny and circumstances where people kind of want to be supportive, but they also don't want any trouble, and
Right.
We really get close. It gets difficult to tell the difference between what's avoiding trouble and what's telling people they should calm down and not freak out. Yeah.
I, right, right. Well, this is the thing, because so much of it ends up enabling this to just continue over and over again, right? Because again, we typically minimize and deny the experiences of women, and prioritize the narratives of men.
Yes, and
And
excuse me, but to clarify
yeah,
that, I did mean by telling
yeah,
women typically to calm down and not freak out is indeed minimizing. Thank you.
exa exactly, exactly. Yeah. And again, doesn't get to the root of, because, well, and to your point of, do I want to get involved? Do I want to get into trouble? Is so much of this gets painted as just an individual problem. Well, it's partner, they're in a relationship. Do I want to get involved in their relationship? And again, shows how atomized we are as a society, that we don't see each other in community and understand that if someone is suffering in a relationship, that's having deleterious effects on all of her relationships with everybody else that she knows. And again, the cost of just leaving somebody in that situation, well, she'll sort it out, it's none of my business, I don't want to cause trouble. Okay, well, it might get to the point where she dies. That's a reality, right? Doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. And do you want somebody that you care about suffering in an abusive relationship for months, years, decades? Because that also happens. Again, I always think about the human potential that gets wasted because people don't believe that they're worthy of anything else, and we don't let them know that they are worthy of something better than the situation that they're in.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, the $1 million question: how
Mhm,
can we best support victims of domestic violence and let them know that
mhm.
that we're listening, we're willing to listen, we care about them? How do friends on social media, in real life, in this person's orbit, to whatever extent it may be, most effectively support them, Vanessa?
So again, my major is sociology. I always think of things on the macro level as well as the micro level. So on a micro level, you want to listen to the people in your life that you think are being abused. If they tell you stories, listen, believe the stories. It is more likely than not that they are telling you the truth and that they are actually minimizing their experiences and they aren't telling you everything. Again, we have these narratives of the hysterical woman lying to ruin men. It's more likely that if somebody is telling you about the abuse they're experiencing, it's a tenth, it's a hundredth of what they have actually been through. So listen to them, believe them, and then give them the support that they need. Again, so much of it is listening to victims and having them tell you what they need. And so again, it ties into like, okay, can you provide social support? If somebody is leaving, can you find them a domestic violence shelter? Do you have a friend out of state? Like, can you help? And be honest about how much you can help and what you have the bandwidth for. Because again, there's nothing worse than promising something and not delivering with somebody who has already been through so much. And then, like I said, on that macro level, push for legislation, for stronger domestic violence laws, for stronger order protection laws, that for laws that actually take domestic violence seriously, fund organizations that actually protect women, that actually get them out of terrible situations and help them find better lives somewhere else. Again, write your legislators. There are people who can make these changes, and you can also do so much work on the local level in terms of government if you want to see change in the world, because it is a social problem, not just an individual problem. So as much as you can support a friend or a loved one who is experiencing this, you also need to push on the broader level to make sure this doesn't happen to anybody else.
Thank you.
Mhm.
For those who would like to further explore this topic, Friday, January 27th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the next episode of Expanding Frontiers, hosted by Erica Lukes, will welcome Amy Braley Frank. She is a advocate for victims of domestic violence, and that show can be found by visiting our website, expandingfrontiersresearch.org, and at the top of the page, from the menu, choose video, which will take you to a video page where you can browse past episodes of Expanding Frontiers. I want to again thank Vanessa for joining me today and having this discussion. Thank you.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Sure. And thank you for giving us a watch or a listen. Thank you.